This morning we're going to continue looking at areas of the Christian life where maybe we can improve, or maybe some things can benefit us if we understand how to handle certain things better. And today I want to look at a subject that on the face of it may not seem to be very inspirational, but in Jesus we can always find inspiration. And the subject this morning is depression, as you might have told or realized from the sermon title. I think we all get depressed sometimes, whether it's just down in the dumps, as they say. Who knows, if my team happens to lose the big game, I might be a little down in the dumps tomorrow. You know, it happens to everyone. I'm actually sort of hoping that the people in Boston are a little down in the dumps tomorrow. Don't hope that for them, but they just would be. Don't want that to come out the wrong way. But I think at some time or other we all tend to find ourselves somewhere on the depression scale, if we can call it that, where at one end, you know, you make an occasional visit or two, but it's nothing major. But at the other end, you have the people who are constantly there. They have virtually moved into a house of depression and have started painting the walls gray to match their mood. These people are what we call clinically depressed. They're actually diagnosed with this condition. But even if that's not you, if you're not a serious case, I think that this message can still apply to you. If there's ever been a time when you're not happy, then it applies to you. You may remember hearing from a few years back the passing of comedian Robin Williams. He took his own life back in 2014. And I think that the shock for many people came whenever we heard of this great comedian who always seemed to have a smile on his face. And from our perspective, sitting in front of the television, watching him in movies and television shows, we just see this guy who's always smiling, always laughing, but we don't realize that he's a person just like you and me. And in interviews leading up to his death, Robin Williams admitted that he had battled severe mood swings. And he admitted that he had very deep lows at times because of depression. Depression is and can be a touchy subject, especially in church. I think a lot of the problem is that we aren't doctors. There's so much about the mind that we don't understand, and there's even a lot that the doctors themselves don't understand. And because of that, people tend to oversimplify things too. We know from reading the Bible that we're supposed to think positively about things. So if we meet a person or a friend who says that they're feeling a bit depressed, we just tell them, just think positively. Well, it's not always that easy, now is it? Other people, they try to guilt a person into recovery by saying depression is a sin, so you simply can't feel that way. Well, I wish that those people could travel back in time and talk with the prophet Elijah and tell him that he needs to think positively and that he should not fall into sin. And that's where we'll go this morning, back to the Old Testament book of 1 Kings, and look at this great prophet of God who experienced depression and see what we can learn from him. The background of the story is that our friend, and I say that jokingly, our friend Jezebel, she was out to get Elijah. She flat out wanted him dead because he was messing with her religion. And he was having her false prophets exposed as the frauds that they were and killed. Now Jezebel, you may know, is one of the most manipulative and evil women that we find in the whole Bible. And she was focused like a laser on eliminating Elijah. So we'll pick up the story by reading verses 1 through 12 in 1 Kings 19. And if you're following in your pew Bibles, you'll find it on page 255. And the word of the Lord says, beginning in 1 Kings 19, verse 1, "Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done, and how he had killed all the prophets with the sword. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, 'May the gods deal with me, but be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them.' Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went a day's journey into the desert. He came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. 'I've had enough, Lord,' he said. 'Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors.' Then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. All at once an angel touched him and said, 'Get up and eat.' He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, 'Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you.' So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. There he went into a cave and spent the night. And the word of the Lord came to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' He replied, 'I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too.'" I'll actually stop there because it goes into God's response, but we're focused on Elijah today. So may the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and the hearing of his holy word. Amen. Here we see Elijah at his low point. And certainly not acting like the way we think a Christian ought to be acting. And don't we preach all the time that you shouldn't run from your problems? And moreover, you need to trust God through the tough times? Elijah is not doing any of that right now. He knows he's being chased by a crazy, angry woman who wants to kill him. She is actually so psychotic that she even sends a messenger to give advance notice that his days are numbered. And she says, "In one day you will be killed." And Elijah's just had enough, and he simply wants to end it now. And this leads to our first point this morning, that no matter how we are ever feeling, it is not a sin to be honest with God about our feelings. If anything, by verbalizing our troubles to God, it may actually help us see any flaws in our reasoning. And we'll see that in Elijah shortly. In so many words, Elijah is telling God, "You know, God, I have faithfully served you for so long, and now look at the trouble I'm in, and I just want out of this life." This is actually a common complaint to God. People say these things to God as if God is violating some kind of promise that he made, but the fact is that God never made such a promise to his people that their life would be easy. It's like what Jesus said when he said, "Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." It doesn't sound like an easy go of it to me. So Elijah goes on and he says, "I alone am left, and they seek to take my life." Now, is what he said actually true? Is he the only one left? No. We read on and we know for a fact there were other believers out there. But this was the way Elijah was feeling. He was feeling like he was the only one left with no support. And God later takes the opportunity to correct him, telling him in verse 17 that there are 7,000 others who have not bowed their knee to the false god Baal. Furthermore, we can see how Elijah's logic is flawed. He's saying that because someone is out to kill him, he hopes that God will take him instead. Now, when you really think of it, wouldn't this make a person be even more eager to overcome the enemy? You're the last man standing, or at least that's how you perceive it in your mind. So why would you give up so easily? Through his depression, Elijah wasn't thinking straight, and this is a theme that is going to come up a lot this morning. It's like in the movies where there's this problem that something is threatening, say, a nation, and they go out and they find that one person left with the ability to overcome the enemy. And we've seen that storyline 1,000 times in the movies. And it's the same with Elijah when he says, I feel like I'm the only one left here on the good side. And the important thing is, whether he's right or wrong, it is good that he was honest with God about his feelings. So in response to Elijah's request to die, what does God do? Well, God could have given Elijah a very harsh rebuke. He would have had every right to do that. He basically says, Elijah, I chose you to be my prophet because I knew the extent of your faith. But, Elijah, you let me down. How dare you come to me with incorrect facts because you aren't the only one left. There's 7,000 others that you don't even know about. If God would have done this, he would have been completely justified in rebuking Elijah. But he didn't do it. Instead, what does he do? He ministers to Elijah instead by sending an angel to feed him, giving him food and drink and rest, and then giving him more food and drink afterwards. You see, God created us with physical needs that need to be met. So this is an important area in ministry that I think that the church needs to be aware of. Because we aren't always taking our physical needs into account. But for now, there's something common with those suffering from depression, and I mentioned it just a minute or two ago, is oftentimes they simply aren't thinking straight. So from an outside perspective, when you're speaking with someone who is dealing with this, it's common for us to see their error in judgment. But the one who is dealing with that simply can't see through and make sense of all these things all the time. There's a story to illustrate how difficult this can be. And so to help those people, how difficult it can be to help those people, and this story concerns a psychologist. And he is walking along the beach, and it's one of these genie stories where he finds a bottle and a genie pops out. And the genie, instead of offering him 3 wishes, just offers him 1. But he says, whatever you want, I'll do my best to grant it for you. And the psychologist thinks for a minute, and he says, I'm scared of flying. So he says, I've always wanted to visit Hawaii. So how about building a road from California to Hawaii for me? That way I can get back and forth rather easily. Genie ponders this, and he says, I'm sorry, but I just can't do that. There's some things in the 21st century that are beyond my ability. Just think of all the concrete I would need to hold up the road and how long the columns would have to be to reach to the bottom of the ocean. Oh, don't even get me started on the governmental regulations of such a project. So it's just too much to ask. So the psychologist says, all right, well, I gave it a shot anyway. And he thinks for another minute for a reasonable request. And he says, how about give me the ability to understand my patients? I want to understand why these people who come to me are so temperamental, why some of them are difficult to get along with. I want to know what they really want so I can help them the best that I can. Can you do that for me? And the genie pauses and thinks about it a minute, and he says, about that highway, is that 2 lanes or 4? At times it can be very difficult to understand a person who's not thinking straight to begin with. And we see that in the story of Elijah. So another concept is one that we see in him, and that's oftentimes we have short memories, especially in regards to God. It's like they say, we always ask God, what have you done for me lately? What often happens is we get so focused on the problems of the day that we forget all the ways that God has helped us through all the difficult times in our past. And it should be no surprise that we fall into that trap, because it even happened to Elijah, who was one of the best prophets in the Old Testament. His cry for death showed God that he didn't trust God to get him through this latest trouble. Of all the people in the Old Testament, Elijah would be at the top of the list of guys that you would expect would exhibit the utmost faith that God would deliver him from this trouble that he's dealing with. If you remember 2 chapters earlier, Elijah had no food, but he was fed by ravens. That was a miracle. And that miracle stemmed from another miracle where God worked through Elijah, interestingly enough, to call a drought for 3.5 years. But the miracles weren't done there. How about the son of the widow of Zarephath? If you remember that story, first God called Elijah to go visit this woman so that she could feed him and keep him alive. While he's there in her house, her son happens to die. And then what does God do? He uses Elijah to resurrect her son back to life. Yet another miracle. And one more for good measure is the miraculous offering that Elijah was involved with when he was pitted against all the prophets of Baal. If you remember that story, Elijah took water and soaked this offering so much that he got it good and wet, so no one could deny that this was a flat-out miracle whenever fire fell from heaven and consumed that offering. Elijah knew all these things in his mind. He was there for all of them and experienced them all. Yet, in 1 Kings 19, he's not focused on all that stuff when he's on the run from Jezebel. He's only focused on the present, and that was his downfall. And it's ironic, too, because Elijah is known as one of the greatest prophets who has exercised more faith than most, yet we see here that even the best can have an off day, as he showed a lack of faith. The way that Elijah shows this lack of faith is actually rather subtle whenever you're reading the text. And you may only notice it if you're aware of the geography. Of course, I don't have a map here, but I think it's rather simple to follow. We read that Elijah travels an extra day into the wilderness. Now, the wilderness, translated as the desert in your NIV, okay, there's really nothing in the desert, so why are you traveling a day farther than you have to into the desert? Well, and frankly, I'm surprised that when he's there, he even finds a broom tree to sit under. But he does, and that's where the angel ministers to him. After getting food in his belly, he gets up and he travels for 40 days and 40 nights to what they call the mountain of God, Mount Horeb. And the interesting thing is that Elijah took a lot longer on this journey than he really should have, or at least could have. Again, back then they're traveling by foot most likely. And when you do the math, which I did, he traveled an average of 6 miles per day for 40 days. Now, back then, and even now, a person can easily travel 3 miles an hour, you know. And if you travel even 10 hours a day, that leaves you 14 hours for eating, resting, and whatever else you want to do. You can cover 30 miles in a day. So, why did it take him 40 days to do this? Why was he so slow? It could be because he was suffering from depression. When you're depressed, your body doesn't function as it normally does. And it's not just your mind that's affected, but your whole body too. I just imagine him trudging along. Maybe he's traveled some, then he stops and sits down and looks around, takes a break, gets up, travels more. You know, he's really not in any hurry to get anywhere. that he finally reaches his destination after 40 long days and nights. And he gets to the mountain of God. And how does God greet him here? God says, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, it's hard to know how to actually use the voice inflection with that. I think of it more as, "What are you doing here?" You know, it's a little different when you say it that way. You shouldn't be here, I think is what God's actually telling him. And these aren't the words that Elijah is hoping to hear after traveling 250 miles in 40 days. But maybe that's what Elijah had to hear. Maybe he had to hear the truth. And maybe someone here at some point in your life has heard God say, "What are you doing here?" It's like God's giving a dose of tough love. Stop feeling sorry for yourself, get up, brush the dust off, and don't wallow in your self-pity. Do something about your situation. Maybe it's God's way of telling you that you ought to be doing something about your problems rather than sitting back and waiting for Him to do it for you. Maybe we have this idea in our minds that we're going to expect God to take care of it all by Himself, or worse yet, in Elijah's case, he's asking God to simply remove him from the world so he doesn't have to deal with it. Usually God doesn't work that way. He doesn't sit around in heaven twiddling his thumbs just waiting for us to get in a predicament so that we can put Him in motion and He can swoop in like Superman and save us. Reminds me of a story, a brief one, about a guy who went to his doctor for his annual physical, and he relayed to his doctor that he had been dealing with some feelings of depression. And the doctor says, "I'm going to prescribe for you a blood transfusion." And the man, of course, wonders why a doctor would do such a thing. And he asks him that, and the doctor says, "That's because you need a healthy dose of B positive." Yeah. This is obviously a funny example, but it's another way how people oversimplify things. But oftentimes it takes a lot more than being positive to get out of depression. Depending on the circumstances, there may be a variety of other factors that are leading to the way that you're feeling. Scientists, doctors tell us that depression can be worse if there's a family history of it. They say there's different chemical levels in your brain can be off. That can contribute to it. The amount of alcohol that a person consumes can certainly affect it, and any drug use can do that too. And I never want to oversimplify the causes or the solutions to something like this, but I do know that there are certain things that you can do to at least minimize the effects to the extent that we can, even if you don't suffer from severe cases that are considered clinical depression. We start with taking care of our bodies. You can go to the bookstore and you can find a whole section of self-help books that tell you how to take care of yourself and what to eat and what not to eat. And I think in church we often focus so much on our spiritual well-being that we sometimes neglect our physical well-being. And I'll be the first to admit that my physical appearance is not my top priority in life. If I went to the doctor and he said there's something serious I need to address, I will address it, but I'm busy living, so it's just the way it is. And you all know that based on the number of times that my ice cream freezer affects my messages, physical well-being isn't at the top of my list, but it is important to take care of ourselves, though. And since we're looking at Elijah, we can see how God thought enough of his physical well-being by sending an angel to minister to him and to feed him while he was in the wilderness. He was tired after being scared and fleeing for his life. And you see, when you're depressed, your physical ailments just pile on your already bad self-image. It's like thinking, nothing seems to be going right. and I have nowhere to go, and now I'm tired, and now my feet hurt, and my body aches, and it just piles on. And it's simply one more thing now you have to worry about. There are a lot of ways to take care of yourself physically, but first of all, don't overexert yourself. Always take a good rest. One of the 10 Commandments is to observe the Sabbath day, and that is a requirement that's actually been fulfilled. And the New Testament church is not required to keep the Sabbath day, or else we would have been here yesterday. But even so, we are not required to observe the Sabbath day. A Sabbath rest is always a good idea, because God created our bodies with that in mind, that they need time to shut down and repair. And that's why most of us go to bed every night. Back in 1965, there was a young man, and I say young man, I think he was about 17 years old. He set the official record for continuous hours awake, voluntary sleep deprivation. This young man was awake for 11 days and 25 minutes straight. There are a couple problems with attempting such a record. The first is your attention span becomes like a gnat after a day or two. It really does. It sounds funny, but it does. And secondly, sadly, some people have attempted to break this record and have not lived to tell about it. Yeah. The effects of your body not having regular sleep is so severe that the Guinness Book of World Records does not print these records anymore, so that people will not be tempted to try to break them. And doctors tell us that if we regularly don't get at least 7 hours of sleep per night, you are 4.5 times more likely to suffer stroke. What it boils down to is that depression is something that we all feel from time to time. And my little bit of advice is don't listen to anyone who gives you a simple solution for your problem. Just stop your sin. Just think positively. Just trust God. The fact that they're using the word just should be a dead giveaway that it's oversimplified. When you get to feeling this way, don't take out your anger and frustrations on God, but do be honest with Him about how you're feeling. And it's nothing that He doesn't know already. Also, take care of yourself by taking care of your body. It makes you feel better, and your benefit is that you won't be at a high risk of other diseases creeping in. If, say, you've lost your job and now you're arguing with your husband or your wife, the last thing that you need on top of that is to get sick. Getting sick sometimes can be prevented, where if you're just moping around saying, oh, woe is me, nothing's going right, and you loaf around and you don't exercise and you don't eat right and do all those other things we're supposed to do, you're just leaving yourself open for something else to go wrong. And that piles onto your depression and makes matters worse. Lastly, we look at Elijah, and we think of this great prophet who was known for this wonderful faith. And we can see that even if he was feeling the way that he was, we aren't weird or strange if we feel that same way. It just means that we're human, just like he was. And the good news is that we serve the same God that Elijah served. The same God who pulled him out of this, who set him on track to lead 7,000 other believers as well. Elijah was not alone, and we're not alone either, even when we may feel like we are. I can tell you that if you talk to God every day, and if you regularly read His Word, you will be more prepared to endure the times of depression, even if it's just simply being down in the dumps for a day or two, than you otherwise may feel, because you are finally in line with the will of God and His will for your life. Let us now go to Him in prayer.